the UFC returned. They were the first sports league to really resume since the basketball canceled the rest of their season, and then every other sport outside after them started one by one. The dominoes started falling, and leagues were put on hold going back to March, I believe it was 12th. So just about 2 months, really. So UFC was the first to come back, first really major sports league that could not have social distancing enforced, right? Horse racing is still going on. Some of the bigger events, the bigger races were canceled, but horse racing is still going on. NASCAR is going to resume this weekend. Excuse me. But UFC was the first to return. Now the question is, because there's some positives, some negatives. We'll give you both coming out of here. But the question I want to take away from and discuss with you here is, with the UFC returning, do they help or hurt the chances of sports returning this summer? Now, theoretically, it should help, right? For sports league to resume. The event went on. It wasn't canceled. It went on. Seemingly, none of the fighters got sick. Now, I guess we'll find out maybe in the next coming days as tests continue to be administered and we find out the results. But so far, so good that only one fighter got sick. But the event still did go on, did not get canceled. And theoretically, they are going to carry on with their next two events, which is this upcoming Wednesday and this upcoming Saturday. So in theory, it should be a win. In theory, it should be a blueprint saying sports can resume. Absolutely, there should be no problem. And baseball should get back to normal. Basketball should get back to the normal. Hockey should get back to normal. And let's start carrying on with our day and getting sports back. My big takeaway is that with the UFC returning, see what happened between a fighter getting sick. I think it hurts, honestly, more than helps sports leagues resuming this summer, and here's why. So UFC, in theory, should be one of the easiest sports to self-quarantine and prevent fighters from getting each other sick, right? It's obviously you have one person, so the team that's actually fighting is only one person, so you don't have to worry about 25 or 30 or 35 guys all together in one room. Now, there are obviously, cornermen, there are trainers, there are doctors, so they have a team around them. But the actual on the field or in the cage, I should say, is only one person. So in theory, the UFC should have the best chance of making sure that every fighter is safe, quarantined, and they won't get each other sick. Well, that didn't happen. Ronaldo Souza, one of the fighters that was supposed to fight on Saturday, tested positive, as well as two of his cornermen. They both were asymptomatic. So all three of those tested positive for coronavirus and were unable to fight. They tested positive Friday night. The fight still went on. That fight was canceled, but the rest of the card still carried on Saturday. And this is why I think having the UFC return and seeing what happened is more of a negative to have sports resuming, is because it highlights how hard it is to keep everyone healthy. Like I just said, it should be easy because you can put all the fighters in different parts of the hotel and different parts maybe of Tampa where the fight was and make sure that they aren't getting each other sick. And even in general, just getting sick, right? Less people around them in theory, less exposure. And thus the fighter should stay as healthy as possible. Well, Souza was exposed to a fan member who was sick, had the coronavirus, and obviously that's how he contracted it and gave it to two of his cornermen who, again, all three of them were asymptomatic. But it's extremely concerning to show how really easy it is to get sick and to spread it. So the fighter got sick, gave it to two of his cornermen because he didn't know he was sick, and all boom, just like that, those three tested positive for coronavirus are now out of the fight. What happens when you have the NBA resume, or the MLB resume, or NHL resume? When you have, in the case of baseball, 25 players at least, and they're talking about expanding rosters to 35, 40, maybe even 50 players all together. Same thing with hockey. Basketball is a little bit less, but still you have a group of men together in close quarters, no matter how much you try to social distance, how much you try to keep them away. On the field, especially once the games start, it's impossible to keep these guys away from each other. So it's concerning to see how easy it is to get sick and to spread it. And this is just, again, when it's a one-man team with fighters. I think it's going to be so much harder to contain when it's team sports that are involved, and even with rapid testing. I get concerned that, once one guy gets sick, if he doesn't know about it for even a few hours, how quickly and easily that virus could spread to his teammates, and then what happens, right? As we saw at the UFC, one fighter gets sick, you've canceled that fight, the rest of the card went on. What happens if, the NBA or MLB resumes and a player gets sick? Okay, you can keep them out for 2 weeks in theory, right? Just quarantine them, have the team play basically shorthanded for 2 weeks without that player. Now when he's healthy, have him come back. But what happens if it's that easy to spread or you don't catch it right away, and all of a sudden half the team is sick, or even worse, the whole team gets sick? How are you going to continue a league where 29 teams in baseball are playing, but one can't for at least 2 weeks? That's my biggest concern, and we've said this throughout the show. My biggest worry about sports resuming is that they do it too quickly, because there's no real true way to contain the virus, and that if we get our hopes up, we get sports back for even a week or two, someone gets sick, it spreads, and all of a sudden half the team or a full team now can't play. I don't know how you continue the league. I don't know how you have the NBA playoffs if one of the teams can't play for 2 weeks. Do they forfeit? What if it's let's just take the standings right now. The Nets as the 7th seed, or the Magic as the 8th seed, are playing the Bucks, right? No one doubts that everything's even. The Bucks are going to sweep the Magic. Best case scenario, the Magic win one game. Absolute best case scenario. What happens if Giannis and half the Bucks get sick and they can't play? Is it a forfeit? Do the Magic move on now? Do they wait 2 weeks? Do they play without Giannis and let's say 3 of their starters, and now all of a sudden Milwaukee has to play with basically their bench players as starters? That's what I'm worried about happening, because as we see with the UFC, it's so easy to spread it. And UFC is easy because they have so many fights, they just cancel one. Nothing, for the most part, everything still goes on as normal. But when it's a team sport, when it's a team activity, and you're relying on playing a bunch of people together, playing against each other, even with rapid testing, I feel like it's very hard to contain with sports, and I get worried that resuming could have this happen. And if one player gets sick, I think a bunch of players in the team will get sick. And from there, what happens? It's a big question. That's why I think coming out of this, there's more negative than positive. It gives me more pause and less hope that sports could resume, seeing this happen, than vice versa, seeing the UFC go on, still carrying on even with a fighter getting sick. So I see more negative out of the positive. I try to be as positive as possible. I really do. I'm really not the negative Nelly kind of type. But just seeing the UFC kind of how they went about their business, I just have very major concerns that going forward, if team sports were to resume, they wouldn't be as easily able to just identify one player that's sick and best case scenario, remove him for the team before everyone else gets sick. I really have my reservations about that as well. I will say this. I do want to hit some positives here. I think the UFC also gave us a good insight going forward. If sports to resume, let's say, obviously the main underlying assumed factor is that they do it safely, right? We're not trying to get sports back that's not safe or put the players at risk. So if they are able to resume safely, I think there's 2 things that we saw that are interesting, that are positives from the UFC that can make the viewing experience and watching the game differently than what we're used to seeing. So one of the positives, I thought, everyone is worried about the no crowd, right? And if there's no crowd at a football stadium, no crowd at a baseball game, it's going to be obviously very weird. And there's some concern that maybe the viewing experience at home won't be as great, the game won't be as good, and that it will have a significant effect on the players and, again, watching the game from home. I actually thought for the UFC, no crowd is actually really cool. You heard everything so clearly. You heard the punches thrown. You heard the kicks that landed. And not just that, you hear the players kind of, or the fighters, at least in this case, you hear what they say. You hear them kind of in the corner. You get an insight that you've never really heard before. So if you're watching a football game, if you're watching NFL Sunday with no fans in the stands, we all know, they have mics everywhere. So if you can hear, quarterbacks in the huddle or coaches talking to the quarterback because it's so quiet, or you hear, a receiver talking to the quarterback, talking about some route adjustments or what they're seeing. Maybe some great insight to the game that we've never really seen before that gets lost because of the crowd noise that's constantly there. Even if it's a play that's not that exciting, there's always a buzz in the stadium because there's just so many people there. People are talking. There's always that buzz below the broadcast of the crowd noise that blocks out so much of what we hear actually on the field. And some things that get through that are loud enough to hear obviously goes viral. I think it would provide great insight to baseball, to basketball, to football. If these sports have no fans when they resume, it could be great insight that we've never really gotten before. Almost like an all access that we didn't ask for, that I think will be a byproduct of having no crowd and no fans in the stands and no noise in the stadium. So I actually think no crowd can actually be a positive for a little bit, to kind of pull back the curtain a little bit, see how these players tick, see what they're saying, more so than we would, again, if there was crowd and there was crowd noise in the background as always. And speaking of which, this is also interesting to see how teams and players adjust. You had one UFC fighter, Greg Hardy, former NFL player, credit the broadcasters for helping him make in-fight adjustments and help him win the fight. Because it was so quiet, because there's no fans, and because you could hear everything, Greg Hardy said that he credited and credits Daniel Cormier, who was a former UFC fighter, who's now doing color commentary, for winning the fight because he heard Cormier basically critiquing, saying Greg Hardy has to work on getting these kicks or making sure that his opponent isn't landing these kicks. Greg Hardy heard this in the ring during the fight, mid-fight, and adjusted his style, adjusted his strategy to take into account what Daniel Cormier, one of the color commentators, said, and that helped him win the fight. So I'm really interested to see what happens going forward if defenses can hear the coaches calling in the play, or the defenses can, or the offenses can kind of hear what the defense is saying, or vice versa. Do you have some insight to what the players are saying? If you could hear what the quarterback is saying to the wide receiver. I'd love to see how now defenses and teams have to adjust to basically hear everything that's said on the field. I think it's going to change the strategy for sure, whether it's baseball, whether it's football, whether it's basketball. I think it's going to be really interesting. So like I said, you have a guy right there in the UFC. Credit a color commentator for helping him make mid-fight adjustments on accident. Took those into account, put that in a strategy, and help him win the fight. So I think that is a positive for sure, and the no crowd noise can actually, again, kind of give us some sort of insight and access that we've never really gotten before because so much is lost in the crowd noise. But unfortunately, at least for me, coming out of this weekend, coming out of UFC 249, having a fighter get sick, and having to pull out, and having a cornerman spreading it to two of his guys so quickly, I take more negative out of this weekend than positive. And again, I think in a team atmosphere with baseball, with basketball, with hockey, if you have a player get sick, I have a real tough time right now, at least on May 11th. Hopefully this changes, but on May 11th, I have a real tough time looking at the landscape of sports, especially team sports, saying that if someone gets sick, I have a tough time thinking that they will find it and identify the sick player soon enough to prevent them from spreading it to other players and then thus wiping out half the team or maybe even a full team. That's going to be a major question mark. Leagues can continue if one player is sick. Leagues can't continue if half the team is compromised or even a full team is compromised. So that's why I took more negative out of the UFC returning than positive. Again, hopefully I'm wrong. Hopefully leagues have the right protocols in to prevent this from happening. But right now, with the medicine we have currently, with testing the way it is right now, I am skeptical and definitely seeing the glass half empty than half full on sports returning after the UFC.